مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. صدر فيلم جديد، الجزء الثاني من فيلم كلاسيكي يعود إلى عام 1988 اسمه القدوم إلى أمريكا، من بطولة إيدي مورفي في دور أمير أفريقي. ولكن بالنسبة للأمراء والأشخاص العاديين على حد سواء، إجراءات القدوم إلى أمريكا ليست بسيطة أو سهلة، وإدارة بايدن تريد تغيير ذلك. الهجرة واحدة من أكثر القضايا تأكيدا في مضمار السياسة الأمريكية، وفيما أدى الأمريكيين الأصليين نحن جميعا مهاجرون، ولكن برغم أصولنا المشتركة لدينا آراء مختلفة جدا حول مهاجري اليوم. من جهة يوجد البعض ممن يقولون إننا ينبغي أن نغلق أبواب بلدنا ونبنى جدارا ضخما ولا نسمح بدخول المزيد من المهاجرين أو اللاجئين أو طلبي اللجوء. ومن جهة أخرى يوجد من يقولون إن حدودنا ينبغي أن تكون مفتوحة أمام الكل مهما تكون الظروف أو الأعداد. ولكن الأغلبية العظمى من الأمريكيين يقفون موقفا وسطا بين النقيضين، إنهم يقدرون الدور الذي يلعبه المهاجرون في مجتمعنا ويريدون نظاما إنسانيا جيد التنظيم يقدم حق اللجوء لمن يحتاجون إليه بدون تشجيع طوفان من المهاجرين يفوق كدر نظامنا. هل يمكن للرئيس بايدن تحقيق ما فشل فيه آخر 3 رؤساء، إصلاح نظام الهجرة إصلاحا معقولا؟ لمناقشة سياسات الهجرة في أمريكا اليوم يسرني أن أرحب بالصحفيتين المرموقتين أني جيراتيلي وسارة فيريس. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The administration of Donald Trump will be remembered for many things, from the American carnage inauguration speech all the way to the final days in the insurrection of the US Capitol. But if there's one symbol associated with Donald Trump, it is the wall, the building of the border wall, and the issue of immigration. To discuss immigration today, I'm delighted to welcome 2 outstanding observers, journalists Sarah Ferris and Anna Giratelli. So Anna, let me begin with you. What is the status of the border wall that Donald Trump and his administration promised would be built along the US-Mexican frontier?
Yeah, so I've been down to the border 35 times during the Trump administration. And simply put, it's a very hard question to answer. When Trump came into office, there were about 700 miles of barrier. Now that includes like 300 miles that was a fence you or I could just hop over. It's called a vehicle barrier. So a lot of that was replaced with 30-foot barrier. So technically it's replacement fence, but it does a very different job. When Trump left office in January, there were 450 miles of new border wall barrier that had been installed. So that brings the total border to about 900 miles of some sort of barrier. Keep in mind, the border is about 2,000 miles long. President Biden has suspended construction for the remaining 350 miles that were slated and funded. They were funded both by Congress, what Congress had given them, and what President Trump had taken from the Pentagon and Treasury funds when he declared a national emergency at the border. So at this point, there is more wall. There is not the 1,000 miles for $4 billion that he promised. He had funded 800 miles for $15 billion when he left office.
And Sarah, when you put it all together, did the flow of illegal immigration into the country substantially decrease in the Trump era?
Well, that's another really hard question to answer. One of the really big factors over the last year, of course, is the coronavirus pandemic, and the border has been virtually shut down. And then there's been a lot of difficulty to track those numbers and to look at what the impact is. And Republicans, of course, say that Trump was successful in his efforts. Democrats, meanwhile, have said that he has been trying to demonize this population, and they're trying to use it as a political wedge and looking at it there. And so we've really seen the impact of the amount of energy that Trump and the Republican Party put towards this. The Democrats have been forced to respond, and so there's kind of scrambling to come up with an alternative policy proposal that can get some of these independents on board. Trump made this seem like it was just a national crisis, and of course Democrats are looking for the right response to that. And right now they don't quite have one, and the party is pretty disjointed on this. So there's a lot of questions here in the Capitol about what is the right plan going forward, what can get the whole party to be unified. Right now, it's just these small measures, really just those very minor provisions that they're looking to go forward with, not the kind of large plan that Biden has proposed.
So America is divided on so many issues. What do Americans today, 2021, think about the issue of immigration? Sarah, let's begin with you.
Well, as you said, immigration was absolutely the most divisive issue throughout Trump's presidency. Now we have not only Joe Biden in control of the White House, but Democrats in control of the House and Senate. So they're looking to take advantage of some of the broadly popular measures that have could come up in the next couple of years. They're looking at, this is such a broken system. What ways can we rally public support behind these bills? Maybe get something done. As you said, this is an issue that is just always nagging members of Congress. They're never able to find a way forward, no matter how many Gang of Eight discussions they try to get forward. But what's going to be so difficult is not only the majorities are just so narrow in both the House and Senate, but this is an issue that divides Democrats as well. And so Democrats would have a really hard time agreeing to any kind of sweeping bill the way that a lot in the party are looking to go really big and broad. That's just going to be so difficult given the reality here in both the House and the Senate.
So we're seeing a significant uptick in the numbers of people, especially children, they're trying to come into the United States. So it's not as though from what I gather, it's not as though we have a static issue that politicians need to address. There's an evolving issue that politicians need to address. And before we get in after the break on specific ideas that are germinating on Capitol Hill on this, Sarah, where do you think this issue is on the priorities for the Biden administration? How high does it rate?
That's a great question. Of course, the Democrats are successful in making coronavirus their absolute top priority. Biden had this nearly $2 trillion bill that had almost unanimous Democratic support. That was number one. Democrats are looking ahead to infrastructure, to a jobs package. So they figured this is part of the recovery part of the pandemic response. And that is where almost all of the energy of the party is right now. Of course, there's a very large vocal part of the Democratic Party. They believe that they were the ones that carried Biden over the finish line. We're talking about a lot of the Latino activists, a lot of the civil rights groups that have been really looking for this kind of immigration reform for a long time. And they say Biden did promise to get this done, or at least take some big steps toward this in his first 100 days. That's going to be really tough to see. There's just so much to do with the pandemic recovery, with the pandemic response. It's hard to see any oxygen left to bring up something so big, so divisive as immigration.
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to take a look at what President Biden has done and what might be on the agenda if it can squeeze into the higher priorities in the weeks and months ahead. In just a moment. Finally, after more than 240 years, we have a woman a heartbeat away from the Oval Office, Vice President Kamala Harris. In addition, we have a record number of women in the cabinet, from our first woman serving as Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, to the first Native American and just the third woman to serve as Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. All this progress is a reason to think back to the very first woman to serve in a president's cabinet. That honor belongs to Frances Perkins, a crusader on behalf of workers' rights, who was appointed in 1933 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to serve as Secretary of Labor. Sadly, it was another 20 years before another woman was named to the cabinet when Dwight David Eisenhower appointed Oveta Culp-Hobby to run the newly formed Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1953. Progress here, or lack thereof, isn't a Republican or Democratic issue. It wasn't until the 1970s when Gerald Ford appointed another woman. John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, they had none in their cabinets. What passed for normal politics a generation ago is as odd today as if we were governed by the Knights of the Round Table. It took a long time to have the old boys club make way for women, far too long, not least because our nation was then deprived the remarkable talent of more than half our population. There's much more to do on this, of course, but thankfully, we're making progress. Again, my guests today include Sarah Ferris. Sarah covers the House of Representatives for Politico, a multimedia platform that is all politics all the time. Her focus is the Democratic Caucus. A native of Newtown, Connecticut, she has also reported for Politico Pro, The Hill, The Washington Post, and the Houston Chronicle. Also joining us today is Anna Giratelli. Anna is the Homeland Security reporter for the Washington Examiner, covering, among other topics, cybersecurity and immigration. Previously, she reported for CQ Roll Call, Cox Media Group, Real Clear Investigations, Yahoo News, and The Oregonian. Anna, let's begin with you. When Joe Biden came to office, in his opening day or two, he issued a wide array of executive actions or executive orders. Were some of these on immigration, and what were they focused on?
A lot of them focus on today's topic. He first took action. He put forth the U.S. Citizenship Bill, which is the large, comprehensive immigration bill that's been introduced in Congress. He also ordered that deportations, ICE removing people from the country, stop for 100 days. Now, that has been blocked by a judge. He's also taken other measures at the border, allowing unaccompanied minors to be brought into the U.S. or who arrive to be taken into custody. But a slew of initiatives in terms of opening visas up, vowing for more border security, not in typical measures that we'd see, things that Republicans would want in sort of infrastructure on a wall, but vowing to deal with the root issues, why people are fleeing Central America at such high numbers. And you're seeing a lot of those go into effect. But one thing that a Department of Homeland Security official in the Trump administration had told me before they left was they made it so that the immigration policies of Trump were like a Jenga puzzle. If you're familiar with Jenga, you take one piece out and it sort of might stay, it might fall apart, but they made it very complicated so that the Biden administration right now is having to sort of dismantle everything Trump did and then rebuild everything in a way that works. And the problem is they're facing a crisis at the border with so many people arriving. It's not a good time to have to rebuild in the way that they want to do.
So, Sarah, from where you sit, does this crisis at the border, is that going to fixate minds on Capitol Hill about the urgency of some reform, or are people not going to want to touch it precisely because it is almost radioactive politically, given how much of a crisis there is at the moment?
I mean, you want to think with this many people who are suffering and who are just desperate to get some relief in the United States, you'd like to say that congressmen members up here would have this top of mind. But that's really not the case for most members. It's not even the case for most Democrats. There's just so many other priorities going on. Remember, Democrats haven't had control of Washington for a decade. They have priorities that are stacked so high of things they want to get done. And of course, immigration is on the list, but they want to get done these really big proposals like let's look at, a pathway to citizenship and dealing with a migration crisis, which pops up every couple of months, if not years. It's just not something that they think spending the energy on is a really wise use of their time right now. They're hoping to say, well, maybe we can just get a broader deal done. Let's focus on that, versus what they've done in past years, which is dole out some money here and there. Let's address this at the edges of the problem. But as Anna said, they want to get down to some of these root causes. And of course, this is all really, really complicated. And provisions of Biden's big sweeping plan aren't universally popular. So this is exactly why it's so hard to do. They don't want to address these crises every time they pop up, but they also are struggling to get a broader plan that could maybe fix this for the long term.
So, Anna, I want to ask about one aspect of the overall immigration issue of special relevance to our viewers abroad and in the Middle East. And that's the question of refugees and asylum seekers. This was also an issue on which the Trump administration took one very clear view. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about this and what the Biden administration, at least so far, has decided to do on this issue?
Yeah, so the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, refugees will apply to be admitted to the U.S. On the basis that they're being persecuted back home for a variety of reasons. And when they are approved, they will come to the U.S. Asylum seekers, what the Biden administration is trying to do is get folks in Central America to apply for asylum, so permission to come to the U.S. because they're being persecuted. But asylum seekers historically are people who show up at the border. It could be someone from any country who flies into John F. Kennedy Airport in New York and then seeks asylum. It could be someone who shows up on the southern border seeking asylum. And so with refugee numbers, the Trump administration lowered those to extreme lows, down below 20,000 admitted per year. The Biden administration is looking to raise those to over 100,000 refugee approvals and applications approved per year. And then what happens at the southern border in terms of asylum seekers, the Biden administration is looking for a way to have for people in Central America, say someone in Guatemala who does fear for their life, to be able to go to a U.S. consulate or embassy and apply for asylum there and get into a system, a very smart system, the U.S. system that is able to then process that and decide, okay, if you show up on the border on this state, it looks like you will be a candidate. But those are things that take a lot of time. You need contracts for the systems, employees, how you decide these applications. And so I think what Sarah said was very true on Congress, especially Democrats. You're in a really hard place right now with this crisis at the border, because when President Trump was in office, you could say he's mistreating these people, more needs to be done. But when your president is a Democrat, it puts you in a harder spot. And so I think that the first thing they can do is start looking at, root causes and how to help people apply for asylum, become refugees before they make that dangerous journey to the border.
But what I'm hearing both of you say, if I'm reading between the lines a bit, is that the likelihood of major congressional action, major legislation on this issue in the near term is fairly low. If that's the case, what do you expect the Biden administration to do with a crisis that is growing worse day by day on the border?
The border crisis almost makes it worse for Democrats because Republicans are going to brand a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented people as amnesty and say that it will only encourage more people to come to the border, which it might. And so it makes it even harder then to push that, even if it's a great bill through Congress, because Republicans are really going to push against it. And you have 2022 to think about with the House and Senate. So they'll certainly be using anything to their advantage in just another year.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there on that sort of less than hopeful note. Anna, Sarah, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. He doesn't scream, he doesn't shout. He doesn't throw insults at his adversaries or call them nasty names. He sometimes misspeaks and mixes up words. He sometimes appears confused, but he maintains an even keel. He doesn't throw tantrums, and he doesn't seem to need anger management training. From afar, he seems to go to bed each night thinking, tomorrow is another day. Perhaps that is what got him through the past 50 years in politics. I'm talking, of course, about Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, who just secured congressional approval to create what amounts to the third wave of America's welfare state, following Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. The American Rescue Act that Biden quietly but effectively pushed through Congress is not only the largest spending bill in American history, but a bill that will transform American public life. The headline may be the $1,400 stimulus checks that every poor and middle-class American will receive. The more fundamental change is the child support that every poor and middle-class American with kids will also receive, effectively creating a guaranteed parental income. That's on top of hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of spending for state and local governments to counter the terrible impact of the pandemic, with a special focus, worth also hundreds of billions of dollars, to help schools reopen a year after they were first shuttered by the coronavirus. And he did all this by a single vote in the evenly divided United States Senate. Is the rescue plan well conceived? I don't know. Is it too much money? Perhaps. Will it unnecessarily add to the debt while spending money on foolish things when investments in our nation's infrastructure would have made more sense? Maybe. History will provide answers to all these questions, but by then our nation will have moved on. Rather than debate the details or engage Republicans in a serious give and take, Biden acted boldly, some would say recklessly, to go big in the fight against the invisible killer that has stopped our nation in its tracks. Historically, presidents only get a chance to do 2 or 3 really big things. Some never get out of the starting gate to do even one. For George W. Bush, it was fighting the war on terror, which led him to Iraq and Afghanistan. For Barack Obama, it was dealing with the financial crisis and passing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. For Donald Trump, it was tax cuts and the wall, which never really got done. Now, after less than 60 days in office, Joe Biden secured the biggest spending package in American history. In his quiet way, this transitional president is gambling on being a transformational leader. And he's just getting started. Bahava nasalu nahayat hadhihi halka min barnaamij Dakhel, Washington. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول علاقتنا بجيراننا الشماليين والجنوبيين، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل وإلى أن ألقاكم. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.